It was one small village, but it made its mark. Joining us now to tell us how the actions of a few saved 800 Jews from the gas chambers of the Holocaust. Here's Caroline Moorhead, author of Village of Secrets, Defying the Nazis in Vichy, France. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to TVO on this side of the pond.
Thank you so much.
Village of Secrets. What's the village that the title refers to there?
Well, it's a slight misnomer, but if I'd put Villages of Secrets, it was a mouthful and doesn't sound like a good title.
But it really was villages and not just one.
It was villages, definitely. It was a group of villages on a plateau and a number of little hamlets over about 500 square kilometres. But it was definitely villages.
In Vichy, France, Plateau Vivarais-Lignon. Am I saying that okay?
Absolutely,
What
yes.
did these villages have in common that the inhabitants there thought of essentially defying what 99% of humanity did at the time?
Well, there were a whole lot of different things. One of them was that before the war, when the socialist government passed for the first time paid holidays, this area became somewhere where people went up. And so the farmers and the villages had started little hotels and pensions, so there was room. Then the area had also been used by children's charities as somewhere to send children who weren't very well for clean air. So there were children's homes. And then it was very remote. So those were the geographical things that started it. And then on top of that, it was an area in France where the Huguenots had taken refuge during the wars of religion. So it was a strongly Protestant area, strongly Huguenot. And there weren't only the Huguenots, but there were also the sect called the Darbistes. And the Darbistes sort of crossed between Quakers and Amish, living very much apart. It was part of their religion that you needed to save people in order to get to heaven yourself, and very much also to save Jews. All this played into this story, and the fact is that it was a very snowy area and it was cut off from the rest of France for months at a time, made it this little enclave on its own.
So all of those things combined, keeping it away from prying German eyes, etc., made it appropriate to do what they did there.
Yes.
How well do you think this story, which we'll go into more detail on, how well do you think it's been told over the past 70 years?
I think it's had different moments in its history. I think immediately after the war, when de Gaulle arrived, his intention was to put the war, the bad part of the war year, behind the French and to move on. So what he said was, we will have justice very quickly, but after this, we'll put Vichy behind us and we'll move on. So for many years after the war, very little was said in France about the Vichy years. In fact, it was not really until the 70s, and it was really foreign historians who started drawing attention to the Vichy years. And after that, of course, there was a search for areas where people had behaved well, where people had been hidden, people had been looked after, people who defied the Nazis. And at that moment, this area got a bit of a reputation. But it got a reputation just for this one village. And really what I wanted to write about was that this was really a myth. And there was this very rich history of the whole plateau. And that it was very, very complicated. It wasn't just a simple little story. It was a story on many levels.
Caroline, we have a lot of new Canadians who are just recently arriving in this country from places all over the world. And therefore, I'm not going to operate under the assumption that everybody watching, and I dare say a lot of Canadians who've been here for generations, who know the story and the era of which you're writing. So we probably need to remind everybody that it's 1940 and the Germans have invaded France and they've taken over and run the southern part of the country, known as Vichy. Marshal Pétain, who's a World War I French hero, suddenly becomes a collaborator with the Nazi occupying forces. And I want to get a better understanding, just generally off the top, what did that mean, the creation of this breakaway Nazi-sympathizing republic in the south? What did that mean for the Jews who lived in that part of France?
Well, it came in two stages. When the Germans arrived in 1940, if you remember, they occupied only part of France, leaving Vichy. In theory, Vichy governed itself. In practice, of course, the Germans put pressure on the Vichy government. And indeed, one has to say, Vichy were only too happy to collaborate with the German demands. Now, until 1942, when the Germans occupied the whole of France, including Vichy, the Jews who were not in the German-occupied part of France were relatively safe. When in 1942 Germans took over the whole of France, no one was safe. And it came in several different waves, because at the very beginning, Pétain and Vichy made a sort of pact with the Germans, which was roughly, we will give you the foreign Jews as long as you lay off the French Jews. Now, the Germans never had any intention of honouring this pact, but what it meant was that the French Vichy police, French police all over France, were only too happy to round up all the other foreign Jews who had arrived in France in the 1930s and before, and had found refuge there. So that when the Germans started deporting the Jews to the concentration and extermination camps, they found ready waiting for them in these camps a lot of foreign Jews.
And again, the destruction of European Jewry, particularly in Germany, Poland, I'd even say Hungary and Italy, has been well told. Not so much in France, I think it's fair to say. So give us a sense about how many Jews there were in France before the war started, and then what was left by the end.
France, paradoxically, because it had the most anti-Semitic legislation of any of these European countries, more Jews saved in France proportionally than anywhere else. Just to give you the figures, there were 330,000 Jews in France at the beginning of the war, and 3/4 of them survived, which was a far higher proportion than elsewhere. But the proportion of French Jews to live was much higher than the foreign Jews, because they only really started picking up the French Jews after they'd taken away all the foreign Jews.
Okay, let's start to tell some of the story that you have chronicled so well in this book. André Trocmé. He is a man who's featured prominently in the book. Tell us about him.
André Trocmé was a Protestant pastor. He was a very straightforward, slightly dour, strong figure with very strong pacifist beliefs. And he was appointed to Le Chambon, which was one of the main villages, at the beginning of the war, in fact, before the war. And when the war broke out, when it became clear that there were going to be people on the run and people needed hiding, he was among the first to say, we, as Protestants, must do something to help these people. And so he was one of the early people to start taking in and hiding people who came. He had a sort of network of Protestants in other places and other Protestant pastors, and in due course there were about 11 Protestant pastors working with him in this sort of loose network on the plateau.
And how much convincing did he have to do of the villagers who lived on that plateau for what his plans were to save people?
Not much. I mean, the tradition of these Protestants and these Huguenots on the plateau was one of welcome to the stranger. That was their philosophy. So, and they'd also, before that, they'd taken in some Spanish refugees from the Spanish Civil War. So it was an area where that was happening.
And yet you tell us that the French laws were the most anti-Semitic in all of Europe at the time. Disconnect.
Yes, a disconnect, in the sense that from very early on, it was absolutely clear that the Jews were being earmarked, were being identified. And from very early on, you had to have an ID, and on it, it was clear that you were Jewish. So one of the things that happened on this plateau, which was not Trocmé, but it was to do with the Wilder story, is you got a number of people who became forgers. And what they did was they forged endless false papers, false names, rather brilliantly putting the addresses from parts of France where they knew the records had been destroyed. So there was no way of checking that these people came from there. And they became absolute masters at forging birth certificates, marriage certificates, school leaving papers. Because the more papers you had, in a way, the safer you were. So if you were stopped in the street and you had 6 forms of ID, and they were none of them Jewish, and it was clear, you were that much safer.
And yet, having said that, at a certain point, Jews were targeted for deportation. At what point in the story?
The first deportations happened in early 1942. So before the story of the Chambon really gets going, because in 42 the Germans hadn't yet occupied the whole of France, but the first main trains left in March 1942.
And how did the various Jewish communities react to the order for their deportation?
They reacted often with disbelief, with confusion. They weren't quite sure what they should do. For a long time, they believed that French Jews were safe. So no effort was really made for the French Jews to hide or to get false IDs. That went on for a very long time. Irene Nemirovsky, who wrote Suite Française, she was a French Jew, and she never believed she was going to be picked up and deported. And that was true of quite a lot of the French.
I heard that over and over again with Holocaust survivors I've talked to, who say it was happening to us and we couldn't believe it was happening to us, which is why we didn't resist in the way perhaps we should have, or you might have thought we would have. Similar story here.
Absolutely similar.
How did the social welfare organizations manage to convince parents that they should part with their children, presumably temporarily, but for all they knew, it could have been forever?
I think that is, for me, was one of the most touching things about the research. What happened was when these camps had been opened and all these foreign Jews and their children had been taken to these camps, it began to be realized what was happening, that they were going to be picked up and taken. However, neither the Germans nor the French were very clear about the position of children. For a while they said the children should go too, then they said the children shouldn't go, and then the French said, but people make an awful fuss if they see children going on the trains, and then they said they'll make an awful lot of fuss if they see children crying and having their parents taken away. They couldn't decide. And into this gap, if you like, came the welfare organizations. And they got permission from Vichy to go into the camps, to say to the parents, let us take your children nearby and we will look after them. And they said to Vichy, and of course, when you want the children, call on us and we'll give them back to you. They had never any intention of doing that. So when the deportations began, and Vichy said, well, where are the children? These organizations would say, not quite sure where they went. We know we sent some here and we sent some there, but take us a while to talk. And there is a particularly touching camp called Vénissieux, and that all took place in the space of 2 nights. What happened was all the Jews in Lyon were rounded up and taken into Vénissieux to be put on trains for Drancy, which was the holding camp in Paris, and then for Auschwitz. And this group, 2 priests, several Jewish organizations, a little group of people who I write about in the book, went into the camp. And they had printed, because they needed them, statements which said, I, and then the name of the parent, give to you my daughter X to look after under the aegis of the Catholic Church, for the parents to sign. It was absolutely clear that everybody knew what was happening. So when the parents signed, they actually knew that this was saying goodbye to the children. And there are these totally touching scenes. The electricity went, there was a storm, so they had torches. So they went around these families and showed them the bit of paper and said, sign here. And the parents gave their children. And there was this absolutely touching thing, was that in the morning when the children were taken away by bus, the parents were sitting in this canteen and they were crying and crying. But the children through the darkened glass couldn't see them, so they were looking out and waving in this cheerful way. Now what then happened was these buses were whisked away, and far from going to somewhere where the children could be found, they scattered the children everywhere. They took some up to my plateau, they took them all over the place. So 48 hours later, the orders came, what have you done with those children? There'd been a mistake, the children were meant to go too, give us the children. And the organization said,
they're gone.
What children? We don't have these children.
What percentage of the kids who were secreted away in that fashion survived the Holocaust?
All of them.
All of them. What percentage of their parents did not?
I think from that particular lot, I don't think any parents came back.
So no happy reunions after the war?
No.
I want you to tell us about 2 Jewish boys in particular, and I hope I say their names right, Simon and Jacques Livéran.
Yes.
Their story is particularly heartbreaking. Tell it if you would.
It is very heartbreaking. These were 2 brothers and they had a sister. And their parents were makers of belts and in Paris. They did part work. And when the orders went up for the Jews to register themselves, these people thought, well, of course, that's the thing to do. So off they went to register themselves. Now, because of the funny way the laws worked, the 3 children were actually naturalized. And so, in theory, they weren't in danger. But anyway, what then happened, fast forwarding a bit, the father was taken away, and he was in a camp somewhere. And the mother, who was not very well, was left with the 2 children and a new baby. And she said to the 2 older children, you stay here, I will go and I will send for you. I will cross the border into Vichy, France, where we'll be safe, and then you can come and join me. And all this happened, except that when she called them to come, she was very ill, it was the border town, and she had to get somebody to take the children across the border into Vichy, France. All this story went on. And in due course, these 2 little boys were whisked up to the plateau by one of the organizations. So the same as all these other children, taken by the organization, put on a little train, up into the mountains, taken in by 2 farmers. The trouble was that Jacques was still a baby, was still small, he was 2.5, and he was taken in by one farm, and Simon, who's the older brother, was taken in by another, and he wet his bed. And in due course, the farmer's wife said, I can't take him anymore. So Simon would go over and see him and say to him, listen, you can't do this. You just cannot go on doing this because it's not going to be all right. Little boy went on doing it. And then this is the touching story. One day, the farmer's wife said, okay, this is it. Either it stops or he has to go. And so Simon went over and hit him, hit the little boy very, very hard, and said, I will do this to you worse and worse every day unless you stop. And he stopped. But he would never have anything to do with his brother again. Not then, not ever again. And when they grew up and grew old, they were never friends again, which is a terribly touching story.
And tragic.
Tragic story.
It does raise some questions about post-war identity and that kind of thing, because as you point out, a lot of these children were so young, they didn't know they were Jewish, they didn't really understand what had happened to them during the course of the war. How did they begin to figure all that out after the war was over?
At the end of the war, there were about some 5,000 Jewish orphans. A small number of those were French, because more French parents had been saved. So that they were small Jewish children from all over occupied Europe. And the question is, what did you do with them? What did you do with these children who had lost their parents, who had watched their parents probably been taken away, who had lived for years with other people up in the mountains, who were lonely, frightened, angry? LOSE, which was the main Jewish organization looking after them, tried first of all to trace families in mostly America or Israel, and a number of children went off and joined them. And then they were left with a number. And they tried a number of things. And what is most interesting from that research is that the ones who fared best are not the ones who went off to families. They're the ones who stayed together in groups, in little homes, if you like. And that was because when they went back to normal life, people tried to make them forget the war. So they couldn't talk about what they remembered and what they knew and what had happened to them. Whereas those who stayed together had shared the same experience and were able to go on talking about it. And it's been found that those in the end were the ones who did best.
And I guess some of the kids, lived relatively normal lives, secreted away in the villages of this part of France, right? And, when you talk about the horrors of the war, that's not their experience at all.
No, it isn't. You have to remember what those villages were like in 1942, 3-4. Very remote, very cold, and very dour. Particularly the Darbis, this sect, who were wonderful people, but they were not people who laughed or showed any signs of affection. And one of the things that the children talked about after the war was their gratitude at having been saved, but also the fact that during 2 years nobody ever cuddled them or and these were small children who were used to big families and a lot of love and so on. So that was very hard. But yes, otherwise they did. They went to school. There was always this element of danger because there were raids on these villages. And, for all the false IDs, it was perfectly well known that there were children hiding. So when, in fact, the people on the plateau had contacts in the plain, and when it was known that patrols were coming up, there would often be telephone calls up, and there would be time to hide the children. And the children would scatter into the forest, deeply forested area, and hide. And when the coast was clear, the farmers would, to collect their charges, would go up into the mountains and sing, and the children would then know it was safe and come back in.
That was the signal to come back.
Right.
To your knowledge, any children discovered on any raids who ended up being taken away by German soldiers?
Yes. Not, an astonishingly small number, given the number that were hiding. There were 2 or 3 raids which resulted in people taking away, and in particular a group of young men who were taken away from one of the sort of adolescent young men's homes, if you like, and about 8 of them were taken. And again, that is quite a touching story because Daniel, who ran this institution, if you like, it was a sort of college and so on, had been warned, and he could have got away himself, but he just felt he couldn't. So he went and joined them, and so he was taken away, and they were taken first of all to Drancy outside Paris, and he would write letters back to his family saying, it's fine, we're all fine, it's all going to be perfectly all right. And one day the letters stopped coming, and he and these 8 other kids, young men, went to Auschwitz, and none came back. So yes, people did go.
We are, of course, 75 years since the beginning of World War II, and one would think, knowing how the French love to commemorate and memorialize great heroism during that time of their history, you would think there'd be something up in this part of France, in these mountains, a plaque or a museum or something to recognize all of this. Is there?
Yes, but because this is quite a controversial subject, the thing we haven't talked about is this element of the sort of myth and the controversy. In 1990, the new pastor to the area, he was a very nice man called Arnoux, had heard these simmerings of everybody saying, well, it wasn't all truckmen, it wasn't all the pastors, and we Catholics did things and so on. Said, I know what, I'll have a conference. And to my conference, I will invite everybody. I will invite children who were saved, adults who are still alive, and people who did the saving. Everybody. The Maquis, the Resistance, the Protestants, everybody will come to my 3-day conference, and after that it'll all be clear and open, and we'll all acknowledge what happened.
To be held where, the conference?
In Le Chambon.
Okay.
So, telling me this story, he said to me, and you have to believe me, this was the worst single thing I ever did in my life as a pastor, because it opened up this can of worms. And people who'd been slightly saying behind their doors, well, actually I did some things too, came out and said them. So from that day to this area, where so much good was done, is a hotbed of dissent. Villages against each other, Maquis against pacifists, Protestants against Catholics. Everybody has a different view. Everybody sees the story a different way. So to answer your question about the museum, yes, it opened this year, because for the last 25 years, nobody has been able to agree on what to put in the museum. And even now, there's no real agreement. And the whole idea has been slightly hijacked by Le Chambon, and the museum is there. And the other villages are not very pleased.
How do you then, as an outsider, come into all of this and figure out who's telling the truth, what's the real story, all of that?
Well, that has been difficult. And indeed, when I was writing the book, when I started it, and unwisely I would answer the question straightforwardly, people would say to me, who are you going to see? And I would produce some names. They would say, oh my God, you mustn't go and talk to them. They're complete liars. So after a bit I used to say, well, I don't know, who should I go and see, and so on. The sad fact of the matter is that I have never, in all the books I've written, had, in a sense, such hostility. Groups of people who've read the book like it and say that what I've written is right. But there are other groups who are saying that I made the whole thing up. And how people can feel so passionately at a distance of 70 years, it just shows that these are stories that nobody ever gets over.
Well, it also shows that France still hasn't quite yet come to terms with Vichy, has it?
I think that's true, but if you think the Spaniards haven't really come to terms with the Spanish Civil War,
Right.
I mean, these are such deeply ingrained subjects.
I don't think you mentioned anywhere in the book, so I don't know this. You're not Jewish, are you?
No, I'm not.
So why, I mean, it's maybe a facile question, but why care so much about, to spend so much of your life telling the stories of Jewish kids that most of the world didn't care very much about 75 years ago?
I think it's not especially that I'm caring about Jewish kids. I care about people who've been persecuted. I've written quite a lot about human rights in my time. And what I've always been fascinated by was how people survive the unsurvivable and what accommodations people make with life in order to behave well.
What do you think the story that you have told tells us about heroism?
Oh God, I wish I knew. I think what I'd like it to tell is the fact that very ordinary people who are not particularly heroic or unselfish, just ordinary people, you and me, when tested, can actually behave extremely well, can do things with imagination and with courage that are sort of examples.
The lesson, though, is that a small fraction do, and the vast, vast majority don't. Sad truth?
I think so. I think that's absolutely true. And I think that what I liked about this subject was precisely that it wasn't one group of people, that it was a whole sort of people, a lot of people in an area who said, hey, why don't I do that too? You know, I could do this. I could take, I mean, there was this touching thing is when the children used to be brought up, they would be brought up by the Saving Organisation on the little train, taken to the local cafe, and the word would go out, we've got a group of children. And in due course, carts, people on horseback would rumble up, stop outside, somebody would come in and say, I could take 2 teenage boys, I could take a girl, I could take 2 sisters. And nobody ever talked about them being Jewish. They were just taken in.
It's an amazing story, and we're grateful you told it. Village of Secrets, Defying the Nazis in Vichy, France. Caroline Moorhead has been our guest. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.